Hello, welcome. I'm Dan Powers, Executive Director of the Society for Science and User Research Facilities, and I'm grateful to have you here for another session of our 2022 annual meeting. This session's topic is going to be regarding the National Lab Caucus and getting insight into what that legislative group of leaders has on their radar for 2023 and the kinds of priorities that would be shaping some of the opportunities, even the directives that come into the federal research laboratory ecosystem. We're going to be hearing from Edwin Kindler, who is the legislative assistant to Representative Bill Foster from Illinois, who's one of the founding members of the National Lab Caucus. Before Edwin comes onto the screen, let me just give a little bit of framing as to what we're going to be talking about here. As many of you know, the outcome of the November election is going to cause a leadership switch within the House of Representatives from the Democratic majority to then, or what will become the Republican majority. And that will shape some of the leadership across various committees that have influence over federal research activities. And also there's the implementation of various key legislative acts that occurred during the last year or two, in particular, the CHIPS and Science Act and also the Inflation Reduction Act. But there's others that would have influence again over the policy and priorities that would be affecting federal lab research. Edwin's going to be discussing a bit of the Federal Lab Caucus and what its role is, who the members are, and some of its activities. So let me bring up Edwin onto the screen here and just discuss, I'll reference a little bit more as well, that Edwin works, as I mentioned, for Representative Bill Foster. He's the only PhD physicist in Congress and an employee of the Department of Energy's National Laboratories for over 20 years. So that perspective is of keen interest and relevance really to the SSURF network. So hello, Edwin.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Welcome. Thanks for taking some time here. I know we have various additional aspects of federal legislation and what's going to be happening that we've framed out for the conversation here. I was very brief in my introduction. Let me turn this over to you and you could map out what it is that we're going to discuss. This will be a conversation type of session, not really a PowerPoint presentation. But Edwin, over to you. And actually, please tell a little bit of your background and the role that you have on Representative Foster's staff.
Sure, absolutely. Again, thank you very much for having me. My name is Edwin Kindler. I am, like you said, a legislative assistant in the office of Congressman Bill Foster, who represents the 11th district in Illinois. On Congressman Foster's staff, I've been with him for about almost 2 years now, and I handle his basically anything relating to his science portfolio, his science committee work, which includes all things science, research and development, technology, space, also energy and environment, and anything kind of that fits into there. And one of the major categories that falls under that, of course, is the National Labs and the National Labs Caucus. It's something that my boss is particularly interested in because Argonne National Lab sits is part of the 11th District of Illinois. And of course, as you mentioned, he worked for a couple of decades at Fermilab, National Accelerator Laboratory as well. So looking forward to talking a little bit about, what the National Labs Caucus is, like you said, what we've managed to do over the past 2 years in this Congress, maybe some things that might happen in the next Congress, and how things look for science and energy policy going forward.
All right. Thanks. All right. Well, let's start off with a bit of that baseline of describing exactly what is the Federal Lab Caucus and what is a caucus itself. And then, of course, who some of the key players are on this caucus.
Absolutely. So generally speaking, a caucus, I think, might be one of those kind of Congress-specific things that I like to define early on, just in case there are folks who don't know. But it's generally a group of members of Congress that organize around a particular theme. I often kind of liken it to a club in high school or college, French club, art club, math team, something along those lines. And there's a joke that basically in Congress, if there's a particular issue or a topic that you can name, there's usually a caucus for it. Um, in addition to the National Labs Caucus, Congressman Foster also leads caucuses on research and development, blockchain, nuclear security. There are many others led by other members as well. They can be bipartisan or exclusively one party. That depends often on kind of the topic of the caucus. They can occasionally be bicameral, composed of Senate and House members. Generally, I think it's a little bit, for example, the National Labs Caucus is just in the House. And they're usually, generally speaking, a way for members who are interested in a specific topic or want to learn more about a specific topic to connect with other members, find out who else have the same interests, who are potential allies in legislation, or just to learn more about an issue they don't know about. Some caucuses, work together legislatively. Some of them are just about gaining knowledge. And the House National Labs Caucus is a bipartisan caucus made up of both Republicans and Democrats, members of the House, which is dedicated to promoting federal investment in America's 17 national labs, the Department of Energy. It raises awareness, educates members and their staff about the importance of the national labs for economic growth, prosperity, our national security. There are quite a few members. The caucus has 4 co-chairs, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. This past Congress, it's been led by Congressman Foster and Congresswoman Teresa Leger Fernandez from New Mexico. It's also been led by Congressman Chuck Fleischman from Tennessee and Congressman Dan Newhouse from Washington. And its focus is on sharing information about the national labs. Members of the other members who participate, some of them represent national labs. Some of them are just interested in national labs. Maybe there's a national lab in their state, the next district over, where they have, constituents who work at the national lab. Maybe they're on the science committee or very interested in federal science funding. And generally speaking, the way that the caucus spreads information is historically they organize congressional trips, congressional delegations to the national labs to talk about, to bring members directly to the national labs and talk about the great science and research that's being done there. Before the pandemic hit, I know my boss's goal at least was to visit every single national lab. That was right before I joined, unfortunately, in the middle of the pandemic. And that kind of limited the amount of congressional trips that they were able to take in the past Congress. But folks in the audience who work at national labs may have seen one of those trips before the pandemic hit. So that's kind of a basic summary of what the goal is and how they try to get the word out about the great work that our national labs are doing.
All right. Thanks. So in 2023, there's the opportunity perhaps for more travel, just generally speaking, for society here as we're opening up. Did you say that at least this caucus looks to coordinate on bipartisan legislation, or has that historically been part of that caucus's activity?
Not specifically. At least at the time that I've been here, it hasn't been specifically something the entire caucus tries to do together. I know often if you're trying to do majority legislation, it's often a kind of a good starting point of maybe individual members you want to reach out to or work with, or who might be good to work with. Generally speaking, this caucus, as a rule, hasn't done anything kind of unified together necessarily.
All right. So in general, the idea of visiting labs, though, as a bipartisan group, or a portion of that caucus, would seem to be something that's just compelling on its own, but of course would serve other legislative priorities that a given congressperson might have. They're just interested in the kind of science coming out that influences a particular industry that they're looking to support, or has scientific technologies that address an issue or a challenge that they're looking to be able to help solve. All right. Would there be any particular calendar yet that we could be looking to in 23, or I guess we've got to wait for everyone to sort of come in and get all situated in January?
So. Yeah, so that's I think one of the interesting things about Congress is that with every new Congress, every 2 years, the caucus has to be reconstituted. and formally kind of set back up again.
Mhm.
And so in order to plan officially for the next year, I think it has to wait until January. But I had talked to my boss. I know he's very interested in trying to return to get to see every single one of the national labs. And so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to schedule something.
All right. Well, then let me ask, sort of building on that notion of this new rebuilding or the new setup that happens every 2 years, what topics do you perceive as being on the front burner for Representative Foster, but also the caucus in general?
Yeah. So I think a lot of one of the things that's been great, certainly that my boss has been really happy with coming out of the past Congress, is just how much legislation focusing on federal research, on energy policy, but and also a lot of areas supporting the national labs that has been able to happen in the last year and a half, certainly within the last Congress. My Congressman Foster was very invested and very involved in the Chips and Science Act, in the Inflation Reduction Act, in the IIJA, and a lot of those were bipartisan, especially Chips and Science. I know it was bipartisan, and the work from the Science Committee that was kind of the fundamental portion of the science portion of those bills was all very kind of bipartisan supportive. And I know Congressman Foster was very proud of a lot of what happened there, and I would be excited to see in the next Congress, kind of looking forward at how does that set up our national labs? How does that set up our federal science policy going forward in the next Congress? And is the momentum that needs to be continued? Are there additional things that need to be added in? How can we shape that going forward?
All right. Let me ask you if you're aware of any particular conversations that in the energy realm specifically are either happening or likely to happen. I'm thinking in the realms of clean energy, just the nation's energy paradigm, and what we hear Secretary Jennifer Granholm, Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm, speaking about in terms of the administration's goals. Where might some of the legislators be looking to have conversations across that spectrum of our different types of energy?
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time. We'll see how things go. I know, in conversations that I've had with the congressman, about plans going forward. You mentioned earlier that control of the House is shifting from Democrats to Republicans. Of course, so the Senate is staying with the Democrats. One of the things, especially that you learned, that we learned through the National Labs Caucus, is in order to get things done, it's often easier to do things on a bipartisan basis. And there are a lot of areas within, especially energy discussions, which kind of offer that. And so I know one of the things that looking forward may be a point of kind of that bipartisan conversation is around nuclear energy policy. My boss has done quite a bit, especially over the last Congress, with nuclear energy policy on a bipartisan basis. There was an amendment to the Chips and Science Act that he pushed all the way through, focusing on university nuclear research reactors for advanced reactor types. And that was a bipartisan piece of legislation that he did with Representative Caston from Illinois, but also Representatives Meyer and Gonzalez, which focused on the ability to kind of build capacity, build workforce, and allow for the nuclear physicists and nuclear engineers of the future to start talking about this. And so there seems to be a real kind of bipartisan interest in nuclear energy. My boss is also the co-chair of the Advanced Nuclear Caucus, which touches on a lot of those issues, which he leads with Congressman Fleischman as well. And so I think that's something interesting. And the other component, like I mentioned earlier, was the Science Committee is particularly well known for being a relatively bipartisan committee. And the Chips and Science Act, like I mentioned, large portions of that were very, very bipartisan. And there seems to be, it was building on this kind of historical dueling bipartisan proposals to essentially double the science budget. And that kind of spirit of cooperation still seems to be there. And I think the congressman is looking forward to building on this as the next Congress begins.
All right. Would there be any even more niche or particular science policy topics that he's looking to focus on that would be relevant to, I'm thinking particularly Department of Energy laboratories, but this scientific ecosystem writ large?
Sure, absolutely. So there's two things immediately spring to mind. One is that Congressman Foster especially has been particularly interested for a number of years in long-term energy storage, especially energy storage that focuses on seasonal kind of style of energy storage, not just day-night batteries, but something that maybe addresses difference in energy needs between summer and winter. And he's in the past has supported federal funding for that, and I know he continues to be very, very interested in that. And I think that's something he's going to continue looking at very closely. Other niche areas this past week, he actually, along with Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson from Texas, he introduced a bill on critical minerals or critical materials processing technology. It was a bill that would allow the DOE to set up a test bed for new critical materials processing technologies that focus on, ways to process these materials, which are maybe more environmentally friendly, safer for workers, and with the increased need for critical materials with an increased demand in electric vehicle batteries and other kind of technologies that need critical materials, that I think is something that he's going to be paying a lot of attention to. Yeah, I think those two certainly are maybe some of his more niche areas that he's focusing on. Sorry.
All right. Let me ask on a couple questions that would get more to the budgeting or appropriations side of things. There were amendments in the Chips and Science Act in particular that touched on modernizing the federal labs, supporting particularly advanced computing types of resources. There's nuance there to whether certain projects are or line items are authorized versus actually appropriated yet. Of the ones that Congressman Foster is involved in particular, what might you be able to tell us on their status or their outlook?
That's a great question. I mean, so again, for any folks who aren't necessarily very, very tied into the congressional language of everything, there's authorizing bills, of which the science part of Chips and Science was part of, that helps to set up programs, talk about the direction that Congress has for federal programs. And then there's appropriations bills, which provide the actual funding to fulfill the projects that the authorizing bills have set up. I compare it a little bit to authorizing bills being writing the check and appropriation bills being signing and depositing the check.
I like that. That's a good reference.
Yeah. Right now, like you mentioned, Chips and Science the science portion, Chips and Science was authorizing and helped set up a whole bunch of these sections. Like you mentioned, federal lab infrastructure funding, as well as some portions on the importance of advanced computing and other components. There has been some movement. I know the Inflation Reduction Act that passed shortly after Chips and Science did contain some funding for national labs infrastructure. It, I think, was not a one-for-one necessarily with what was authorized in Chips and Science. And then I know there's currently ongoing budgeting discussions that would, I believe, apply to what was set up in Chips and Science. So there hasn't been a fresh budget yet that would appropriate funding for all of these programs. But I know it's something that we're looking very, very closely at, and hope to see progress on it. I know the Congressman has emphasized repeatedly over the years the importance of consistent and reliable science funding that matches kind of the vision that Congress can be sorting out.
Right. Well, speaking of consistent funding, might you have any recent, say, insiders opinion as to what's going to happen by next Friday in terms of keeping the government funded. What kind of tone is there this 1 week out from, unfortunately, perhaps a deadline that causes other ripple effects?
True. Certainly, there's a deadline coming up. I don't have anything particularly to say on that. It's I know it's something that the congressman is looking to get done. I certainly would love to be home for the holidays. But I know there's a lot of folks doing a really important work on there. That's a little bit separate, unfortunately, from what I do. So I don't have anything.
Fair enough.
Really
Yeah. And sorry for the audience. Technically, a week from today on Friday is the deadline for Congress to reapprove a budget to fund the federal government. And right now, things seem to be still somewhat far apart from an agreement being made, but something will come together as it always does.
And as you mentioned, it is, especially in relation to federal science and federal research funding, such as for the national labs, keeping that funding consistent and reliable is very important to making sure that they get to do the world-changing research in science.
All right. Well, could you describe, Edwin, thinking now from the perspective of people involved in science advocacy or government affairs from any given user facility, how would you suggest they engage with Congressman Foster or really the caucus as a whole? And I'll ask, that's certainly a role that SSURF is going to continue to play, and also there's the individual members of the organization who have this as well as part of their responsibilities.
Absolutely. So a couple different things immediately spring to mind. The first is, for those folks who work at national labs or are very closely affiliated with national labs, on a formal level, the national labs do have folks who have congressional affairs teams who interact with Congress quite a lot. I know, especially since Argonne is in our district, our office works closely with the congressional affairs teams in the labs. And then on an individual level, it's always obviously useful to reach out to your member of Congress if you live in a district that does not have a national lab. Still reaching out to a member of Congress to tell them about the national lab and the importance of it, or your interest in it, are also useful. And then finally, and not just because of where I'm speaking today, but professional societies really are very useful. I know we hear quite a lot from professional societies across a wide variety of areas. As the person who does a lot of work in science policy in our office, a lot of the societies I work with are very related to science or math or engineering, and it's always very useful to hear about kind of what is important, especially when legislation like CHIPS and science or other kind of related legislation is coming up, to hear what folks' priorities are. It's always very useful. All
right. Well, it seems that the labs, from our perspective, are a infinite wellspring of examples of brilliant research and manifestation of science in ways that provide technology for solutions across a whole spectrum of challenges that the country is addressing, and we'll continue to provide those examples of here's why it matters, here's what is coming out of federally funded labs, such that they are solutions for the concerns that given Congress people may have. And we'll continue that theme in our outreach to not only Congressman Foster, but the entire National Lab Network, or National Lab Caucus, I should say. And thanks for this quick insight into that group. And we look forward to continuing to engage in 2023 with both on-site visits and more of these webinars. We'll continue the connection. And thanks for making some time.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. And now that we've reached the end, I feel like I should say this is probably one of the first times I've had the opportunity to speak at an event like this. So thank you very much for having me.
Okay, well, welcome. We'll look to bring you back for further conversations where we arrange an agenda that is even more of, say, a spotlight on what you'd like to talk about, or more so that you just should be in the conversation to hear what others are saying. Part of the convening role that SSURF plays for the different thought leaders and other elected officials who are part of our network. So thanks again, Edwin. And
Thank you. Have a great
thanks everyone for making time today for another session as part of our 2022 annual meeting.